This week's suicide bombing in Kabul, Afghanistan, marked the deadliest attack by the Taliban in the Afghan capital since 2011. At least 64 people were killed and more than 300 were injured when Taliban fighters blew up an explosives-rigged truck and opened fire inside a government building. The Taliban, Al-Qaeda and ISIL are just a few of the militant groups responsible for a series of global terrorist attacks. Foreign fighters trained in the Middle East have also carried out violent attacks across Europe, most recently in Paris and in Brussels. We begin our coverage with CCTV's Kate Parkinson. She joins us from Paris. And Kate, how is Europe responding in terms of security measures since the Paris and the Brussels attacks?
Well, the European Union has taken steps to implement a counter-terrorism strategy, but ultimately the responsibility does fall on individual member states. So we have seen varying degrees of measures being taken. Here in France, authorities have taken a very hard-line response ever since the attacks last November, in which 130 people were killed in coordinated bomb and gun attacks. Here in Paris, a state of emergency has been in place, giving police enhanced powers. These emergency measures remain in place today, and they're likely to stay in place for the foreseeable future. Certainly, the French Prime Minister has indicated that the government wants them to be extended to at least the summer, when France is hosting the Euro 2016 football tournament. If you remember, back in November, the Stade de France, the national football stadium, was targeted by 3 suicide bombers, and it's in that stadium that the opening and final matches of this huge football tournament will be held. So French authorities very keen to keep the emergency measures in place. Meanwhile, we've seen heightened security at airports across the continent following the Brussels attacks last month, and there's also been numerous police raids and arrests across the continent. One thing that has become very apparent in the wake of the terror attacks here in Europe is the lack of intelligence sharing across the continent. So individual countries doing their own intelligence, but not necessarily sharing it. And certainly this is something that has proved to be counterproductive in a European-wide counter-terrorism strategy.
And Kate, there have been reports that many of the young men who've become radicalized actually became radicalized while they were in prison. They were convicted for some reason, they get into prison, and that's where they become radicalized. And what kind of efforts are being made to stop that happening?
Well, this is entirely correct. And if you remember, many of the suspects linked to the Paris and Brussels attacks had spent time in prison, and observers say it is there that they believe they became radicalized. And so France particularly, and indeed Belgium, are focusing their de-radicalization efforts on prisons. Here in France, a trial program has been rolled out across 5 prisons in which prisoners who are developing or have developed hardline views are isolated and put through an intensive de-radicalization program. But it's highly controversial. Critics say that putting radicalized prisoners together is extremely dangerous, and certainly there is a lot of question as to whether it will be effective. Certainly the de-radicalization units are extremely new, so there's no evidence at this stage as to whether it is going to solve the problem. There's also a lot of disagreement over exactly what the problem is. Certainly some recent studies have said there is a fundamental misunderstanding about what radicalization means. Certainly the understanding so far has been that it is a gradual process in which individuals slowly become more extreme in their views. They turn to religion, they distance themselves from the quote-unquote normal world and become more fundamental in their beliefs. But you only have to look at the videos that emerged of the Abdel Salam brothers, one of whom blew himself up here in Paris, the other who became Europe's most wanted following the November attacks. We've seen videos of them dancing in nightclubs. We've heard stories from their friends of them drinking, smoking drugs, flirting with girls. You only have to look at this to see that the signs of them having become radicalized were not there. And so if would-be jihadists can drift in and out of jihadi behavior and the normal secular world that they live in, then actually spotting people who've become radicalized and therefore being able to de-radicalize them becomes infinitely more difficult.
Okay, Kate, thanks. That's CCTV's Kate Parkinson reporting from Paris. Since January, various extremist groups have escalated their attacks and targeted civilians in the cities of Brussels, Ankara, Lahore, Istanbul and Kabul. So how do governments fight these non-state actors and end the perpetual violence? We'll ask our panel. Joining us now from Islamabad is Imtiaz Gul. He's the Executive Director and founder of the Center for Research and Security Studies based in Pakistan. Here with us in our Washington, D.C. studio is David Gartenstein-Ross. He's a Senior Fellow at the D.C.-based Foundation for Defense and Democracies. And from London, we're joined by Abdel Bari Atwan. He's the founder and editor-in-chief of the Arabic news website, Rai al-Yom. Thanks to all of you for joining us. David, let me start with you. We have these myriad terrorist groups operating in the Middle East, in South Asia, parts of Africa right now. Some of them, of course, are very well known: Al-Qaeda, Islamic State, Boko Haram, but there are myriad other groups. How did it all start? Can we point to a period when it started?
There's a lot of points of inflection one could point to, but I'd point to a few as being particularly important. One of them is the Afghan-Soviet War. When you look at the global jihadist movement, this time in which you had foreign fighters, as well as people who are engaged in humanitarian services, congregate to South Asia, created this space in which militants who otherwise wouldn't have known each other and might have seen their struggle as being a regional rather than a global one were all able to get in contact. Now, the Afghan-Soviet War came just before the explosion in communication, in the way we communicate. That is, the internet became very big in the 1990s and allowed people to stay in contact with each other and to continue to see their struggles as part of more of a global rather than just a regional movement. The second point of inflection, I'd say, is the 9/11 attacks, which showed how a group like Al-Qaeda could fundamentally threaten and challenge a superpower. And I'd say another important point of inflection is the Arab Spring. And we could see each step of the way you had different shifts in communications, from the internet after the Afghan-Soviet War to the rise of non-Western cable television. Al Jazeera was one important point of Al-Qaeda's story during the first decade of the 21st century. And really, when we look at the past 5 years, the social media revolution, which has been able to mobilize people in an unprecedented way, has been a large part of ISIS's story and the post-Arab Spring story.
Abdel, what is your view on this? As David has just pointed out, there are various points when we see the emergence of these radical groups, but to what extent, for instance, did the invasions of Afghanistan and Iraq by the United States escalate that process when we saw more and more groups getting more and more violent across the world?
Actually, if we go to the Middle Eastern map in the 70s and before that, we will see very rare existence of these kind of Islamic radical groups. I believe if we want to look at the beginning of this, the strong beginning of this kind of non-state actors, I think we have to go back to the American intervention in Afghanistan, and when they actually recruited, with the Saudi help, a lot of Islamic fighters, jihadi in particular. And started from there. Al-Qaeda was actually born in Afghanistan in a way or another. After that, the other American military intervention in Iraq and then in Libya, now in Syria, this actually created the best incubators to these kind of radical Islamic groups. Once you create a failed states, like what is happening in Afghanistan, what's happening in Somalia, Iraq, Syria, Libya. This is the best environment for this organization to gain strength and to find support among frustrated people in the Middle East.
Okay, Imtiaz, we refer to these groups as non-state actors. Let's take Pakistan as a case in point. You have a whole range of groups there. You have the Pakistan Taliban, known as the TTP. You have affiliates of Al-Qaeda, other groups. What kind of impact do they have on the country, on this fledgling democracy, and on just daily governance in the country?
Well, I think our history also goes back to the 1979, which has been a watershed year, beginning with the Iranian Revolution and culminating in the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan. And I think much of our radical Islam, the militant groups, basically were born out of the womb of that anti-Soviet American Saudi Arabian-led jihad from out of Pakistan. Because at that time Pakistan was being run by a military dictator who was eventually embraced by the American administration, by the Saudis, and who himself was a religious zealot, and he introduced a number of Islamic controversial Islamic laws into the constitution that laid the foundation of the militant landscape in Pakistan. And they have sprouted, they have proliferated in a way that when 9/11 then eventually happened, again all of these groups became overwhelmed with the emotions, with the sentiment for the Taliban, who were then being under attack by the Americans and the Afghan Northern Alliance. So as a whole, this has created a huge challenge for the state of Pakistan in its governance structures, in its social structures, as well as in politics. So you have a country which is divided among the pro-militant sentiment, which basically is based on one common narrative, regardless of whether it's Al-Qaeda, it's IS, Tehreek-e-Taliban Pakistan, or many other religio-political groups. They are bound by one common narrative. That narrative is one of victimhood, one is of anti-Westernism, anti-Israel, anti-India, and this has then convoluted Pakistan's political realities, and this is what has led to what we call religious radicalization of minds, which basically is discernible not only in the political circles, but also in universities, in the parliament, elsewhere in the socio-political life.
David, when we look at radicalization of these groups, I mean, we've just heard that some of these groups started out as anti-Soviet groups, sponsored, supported, encouraged by the United States. At what point did they turn on the United States, turn in such a way that it led to attacks like 9/11, and in fact has such a huge impact in the world right now that the entire post-Second World War security architecture in the world has changed?
Yeah, even in the 1980s, these groups were anti-U.S. in their outlook, although they weren't fighting the Americans at the time. Bin Laden, for example, never had love for the United States. If you look at the specifics of what turned Bin Laden decisively against the U.S., a lot of it goes back to the first Gulf War, when U.S. troops were stationed in Saudi Arabia. Bin Laden's view of the Ahadith, the sayings of the Prophet Muhammad, and one in particular which said there should be no two religions on the Arabian Peninsula, was that this made the U.S. an occupying force rather than a force that was defending Saudi Arabia from Saddam Hussein. And so his first public letter was actually a letter directed to the clergy of Saudi Arabia, which had sanctioned the U.S.'s presence there. And thereafter he became increasingly anti-U.S. The very first terrorist attacks against the U.S. were number one in Yemen, when U.S. soldiers were heading to Somalia for Operation Restore Hope, where he bombed a hotel where American soldiers would be staying. Right. It didn't kill any Americans. And it's well known that Al-Qaeda had operatives in Somalia prior to Operation Restore Hope, who, for example, liaised with some of the fighters on the ground. There's a debate amongst observers as to whether they had anything to do with the Black Hawk Down incident, but they were certainly there and certainly had capabilities in shooting down helicopters.
Yeah, but just to clarify this, David, because this is not something we hear very often. Osama bin Laden, his main problem was with Saudi Arabia, not the United States.
Well, he had problems with multiple entities. I mean, his first letter was to the Saudi clergy. Right. But his initial break, like the thing which I think pushed him in the biggest direction of militancy vis-a-vis the United States, was specifically U.S. troops being in Saudi Arabia.
Right. Abdel, is this the prevailing thinking among many radical groups, that Saudi Arabia is occupied by the United States and its allies, that this is the desecration of Holy Land that we're seeing here?
Oh, yes, definitely. When I interviewed Osama bin Laden in November 1996, he told me that, he will continue fighting until no single American troops on Saudi Arabia or the Arabian Peninsula territories. So he was very clear about that. And in the beginning, he wasn't actually anti-Saudi himself. He was actually financed by Saudi Arabia. He was encouraged by the government there, and he was financed in first stages of his jihad in Afghanistan by the Saudi government, by the Saudi money. But things changed completely. The presence of American forces, about 500,000 American Western forces on the Arabian Peninsula, definitely considered as insult to Islam and its values by Osama bin Laden and his groups. So but he used this, to be honest, as a cover, as a pretext in order to continue fighting. He has a personal grudges against the United States. He felt, as he told me, that he was used like a used tissue by disposable tissues by United States. They used him and his actually other mujahideen, Arab mujahideen, Muslim mujahideen, and then they throw them away, and they left Afghanistan completely ruined. And also they, instead of learning their lessons from Afghanistan, they sent their troops to Saudi Arabia. So he actually, yes, he has personal grudges and political grudges against the American and the West in particular. Yeah.
Okay, we are going to have to take a break right now. More of our conversation about terror groups right after that. Stay with us. You're watching The Heat.